Black Sea, Central Sector, 5:11 p.m. The late afternoon sun reflected off calm water. Commercial traffic remained at a distance. Conditions were ideal for aerial surveillance and naval operations. Nothing at first glance suggested that this would become a strategic turning point. At 5:11 p.m., that changed. 3 Russian warships altered course simultaneously. Speed increased. Formation tightened. Fire control radars activated. This was not routine maneuvering. It was not a navigational error. It was deliberate. Ahead of them, a NATO naval group was conducting a standard patrol in international waters, following recognized sea lanes and operating within established norms. No provocation, no escalation, just presence. But to Moscow, that presence represented an opportunity. The objective was clear: reassert regional dominance, test Allied cohesion, force a withdrawal without firing a single missile. A calculated challenge designed to generate pressure, imagery, and narrative control. A limited confrontation, controlled, just short of open conflict. That assumption proved wrong. The moment Russian radars locked targets, data flowed across Allied networks. Satellites confirmed the posture change. Surveillance aircraft detected abnormal electronic emissions. The challenge was being recorded, analyzed, and shared in real time. At 5:12 p.m., Allied command centers were already assessing the situation. There was no confusion, no improvisation. The protocol was clear: hold position, deny escalation, prepare to control the environment. The red line was not crossed with fire, it was crossed with intent. At 5:13 p.m., Allied warships adjusted formation. They did not advance, they did not retreat, they stabilized. The message was silent but unmistakable. There would be no withdrawal. Below the surface, Allied submarines began moving into position, undetected. In the air, surveillance aircraft widened their orbits. Every Russian emission was tracked, every movement anticipated. By 5:14 p.m., Moscow realized the situation was no longer unfolding as planned. What was meant to be a show of strength had triggered a far broader response, and the clock was still running. By 5:15 p.m., the operating picture had expanded far beyond the ships visible on the surface. The Black Sea was no longer just water and steel. It had become a layered battle space of sensors, signals, and silent positioning. Russian commanders attempted to regain initiative. Orders were transmitted to coastal monitoring stations. Additional radar systems were brought online. Long-range tracking assets began scanning for Allied air movements. The intent was clear: escalate pressure without crossing into open combat. At sea level, the 3 Russian warships continued their approach, maintaining aggressive bearing angles. Their presence was meant to dominate the space psychologically, to signal that any further movement would be contested. But the response they faced was not psychological, it was systemic. At 5:16 p.m., Allied electronic warfare platforms activated quietly. No alarms, no visible action, just interference. Russian data links began experiencing latency. Sensor feeds showed inconsistencies. Targeting solutions required confirmation instead of certainty. At the same time, Allied aircraft entered the outer edge of the battle space. High altitude, beyond visual range. They did not carry out attack profiles. They carried something more decisive: control. The sky was being shaped. By 5:18 p.m., Russian vessels detected increased airborne activity, but could not resolve precise positions. Radar contacts appeared, faded, reappeared elsewhere. The picture was fragmenting. Commanders requested clarification from higher headquarters. Responses were delayed. This was the moment the confrontation shifted. Not with fire, but with dominance. At 5:19 p.m., Allied naval units synchronized movement. Spacing adjusted, overlapping coverage expanded. Every Russian ship was now within multiple engagement envelopes: surface, subsurface, and air, without a single weapon being armed publicly. Russian officers understood the implication. Any escalation would not be isolated. It would be answered instantly, from multiple vectors. At 5:20 p.m., Moscow issued revised guidance: maintain posture, avoid first shot, gather intelligence. But the window for leverage was closing. Underwater, Allied submarines finalized positioning. Silent, unseen. Their presence alone shifted the balance irreversibly. Russian anti-submarine sensors searched but found nothing conclusive. At 5:22 p.m., Allied command issued a simple directive: continue denial. No provocation, no retreat. The Black Sea was no longer contested space. It was controlled, and the next minutes would decide whether Moscow accepted that reality or forced consequences. At 5:23 p.m., the confrontation reached its most fragile phase. Both sides understood that the next decision would either stabilize the situation or shatter it. Russian commanders attempted a final show of resolve. One warship altered course slightly, closing distance just enough to signal defiance without triggering engagement protocols. Deck crews moved with visible urgency. Sensors remained active. Weapons stayed nominally cold. It was a calculated move. Pressure without fire. The Allied response was immediate and silent. At 5:24 p.m., long-range maritime patrol aircraft tightened their tracking arcs. Target quality data was refined. Undersea contacts were confirmed and revalidated. The battle space was now mapped in full depth, from seabed to stratosphere. Allied commanders did not issue warnings. They did not transmit ultimatums. They allowed the geometry of power to speak. By 5:25 p.m., Russian ships began to receive fragmented updates from shore-based command. Communications were intermittent. Data packets arrived out of sequence. The clarity Moscow expected was gone. This was not accidental. Electronic dominance had turned certainty into doubt. At 5:26 p.m., Allied surface combatants executed a synchronized maneuver. Minor, precise, unmistakable. It placed each Russian vessel within overlapping fields of control. No missiles armed, no guns trained, just positioning. The message was unmistakable. Escalation would be answered instantly and decisively. Russian bridge officers recognized the reality. Any aggressive act would trigger a response not from one ship, but from an entire system already aligned. At 5:28 p.m., Russian commanders requested guidance. The reply from higher headquarters was cautious. Avoid incident. Do not fire. Preserve assets. The initiative had shifted completely. Below the surface, Allied submarines held steady. They did not close further. They did not withdraw. Their presence, known but unseen, was enough. At 5:30 p.m., Allied air assets began a controlled reduction in visibility, not a retreat, a recalibration. The message was clear. The environment was under control, and escalation was no longer necessary. Russian vessels slowed, formation loosened, radar emissions reduced incrementally. What began as confrontation was becoming containment. The Black Sea fell into an uneasy quiet. No shots fired, no missiles launched, no headlines yet written. But the outcome was already decided. Because in modern conflict, control is victory, and by 5:30 p.m., control was absolute. By 5:31 p.m., the confrontation was no longer about confrontation at all. It was about recognition. Russian commanders now faced a reality they could no longer obscure. The initiative was gone. The leverage they sought had evaporated. What remained was a choice between withdrawal with dignity or escalation with consequences they could not control. At sea, Russian warships reduced speed further. The aggressive bearings softened into parallel courses. Fire control radars were gradually powered down. One by one, emissions disappeared from Allied tracking displays. This was not retreat, it was acknowledgement. At 5:33 p.m., Allied command authorized a controlled de-escalation posture. Surveillance remained intact. Subsurface dominance was maintained. Air control persisted overhead. Nothing was relaxed, nothing was conceded. The system simply tightened its grip without visible force. Russian coastal commands attempted to reassert coordination. Orders were issued, corrections made, but the tempo was gone. The moment had passed. At 5:35 p.m., Russian vessels began altering course away from the Allied patrol zone. Gradual, measured, no sudden maneuvers. The Black Sea returned to predictable geometry. Allied commanders did not pursue. They did not harass. They did not signal victory. They allowed the withdrawal to proceed unchallenged. That restraint carried its own message. At 5:37 p.m., the battle space stabilized fully. Submarines maintained silent watch. Aircraft held altitude and distance. Surface units resumed patrol alignment. Commercial shipping routes reopened incrementally. To the outside world, nothing had happened. But inside command centers across multiple capitals, the significance was unmistakable. A challenge had been issued, a response had been delivered, and dominance had been demonstrated without a single weapon fired. By 5:38 p.m., the Black Sea was operationally silent. No explosions, no casualties, no declarations, just outcome. Russian leadership would later describe the incident as routine maneuvering. Allied officials would say little at all, but both sides understood what those 27 minutes represented. They were a reminder that in modern warfare, strength is not measured by noise, but by control. And on that afternoon, control belonged entirely to one side. By 5:39 p.m., the confrontation had fully dissolved into history. The sea was calm again. Sensors remained active, but nothing demanded immediate attention. The crisis window had closed. What mattered now was interpretation. In Moscow, analysts reviewed telemetry, radar logs, and communication records. The conclusion was unavoidable. The attempt to challenge Allied presence had failed, not because of force used, but because of force that never needed to be used. The Black Sea had been locked down without a single missile launch. That realization carried weight. For years, regional strategy relied on the assumption that controlled pressure could extract concessions. That proximity created leverage. That escalation without gunfire could force retreat. This incident shattered that assumption. What unfolded between 5:11 p.m. and 5:38 p.m. was not a standoff. It was a demonstration of modern deterrence. Allied forces did not react emotionally. They did not rush forward. They did not posture publicly. They allowed the environment itself to become the message. Layered, synchronized, irreversible. Surface dominance, subsurface certainty, airspace control, electronic superiority. Each layer reinforced the next, until escalation no longer made sense. By the time Russian vessels disengaged, the outcome was already irreversible. Any further movement would have invited consequences that could not be contained. Not politically, not militarily. In Allied command centers, the assessment was brief. Objective achieved, presence maintained, stability preserved. No press conferences followed. No victory statements were issued. Silence was sufficient. Because the real audience was never the public. It was every naval commander watching the data feeds. Every planner studying maritime choke points. Every government calculating how far pressure could go before control snapped back. The lesson was unmistakable. In the modern era, conflict is not decided by the first shot. It is decided by who controls escalation before the first shot is fired. At 5:11 p.m., a red line was tested. At 5:38 p.m., the Black Sea went silent, not by accident, not by restraint alone, but by dominance exercised with discipline. That is how controlled conflict ends, and that is how deterrence works, when it is real.